So welcome everyone to this ICCPC Roundtable on the idea of reimagining the ICC Performance Code. The intent of the Roundtable series is to get perceptions and perspectives on performance-based design and performance-based codes and how they can be used to help tackle issues that are maybe challenging with our traditional prescriptive codes, how they open opportunities, but also, challenges that we face in putting in robust structures. One of the reasons that we're looking at the idea of performance again is it's been 20 years since the first edition of the ICC Performance Code. A lot has happened since the initial code was developed. There's been advances in various areas of structural engineering. For example, energy performance engineering has advanced, and that really wasn't addressed at all in the initial ICCPC. And concepts such as sustainability and resilience really were not part of the discussion at that time, but are now key factors in how we're looking at buildings and how we're looking at what we want to achieve for societal objectives and the performance of buildings. So this series of roundtables has invited different views. We've had structural engineers, fire protection engineers, energy engineers, some facility owners and managers. I'll be talking to architects soon, and of course, building and fire officials, and today's discussion is around the topic of resilience. So what I'd like to do is go around the room briefly and have you introduce yourself, say a little bit about yourself, your interest in the resilience topic, and kind of what you hope to either achieve today or see go forward should a code activity in performance go forward in the future. And just to kick off briefly, my name's Brian Meacham. I've been working in building performance issues for over 30 years, a lot initially on the fire side, but I've done a lot of work with countries around the world on their performance building regulations. I work with the World Bank's Building Regulation for Resilience program. And so ICC asked me to kind of manage this effort, in part because I was on the original code development committee for ICC Performance Code, but also can bring some of the international context and perspectives to the discussion. So that's me. With that, I'll turn it over maybe, and I'll just read off of my screen. So I'll start with Bob Pekelnicki.
Sure, I'm Bob Pekelnicki. So I'm a senior principal at Degenkolb Engineers, and my background specifically in resilience goes all the way back to around 2008-9, where I was a co-author of the Spur Resilient City series of articles on how to make San Francisco more resilient. I'm also the author of the buildings chapter in the NIST Community Resilience Guidelines, and recently was engaged by NIST again to work on resilience design criteria for critical facilities. In addition, I do a lot of performance-based structural engineering and involved in codes and standards with respect to performance-based structural engineering.
Thank you. Ryan Kirsting.
Good morning, I'm Ryan Kirsting. I'm an associate principal at Bueller in Sacramento. I've been doing performance-based designs like most of the people on the phone for the good 15 or 20 years. A lot of work on existing buildings originally, but now focused a lot on the performance of new buildings and where our building codes are going in terms of the multiple dimensions of performance, not just life safety, but repair time and repair costs as well. Been involved with a number of ATC projects and FEMA projects. Most recently was one of the lead authors of the FEMA NIST report on improving the post-earthquake functional recovery and reoccupancy time of the built environment. And looking forward to talking about how we can look at a performance code, not just in terms of safety, but communicating the other aspects of performance.
Thank you. John, Applied Technology Council.
Hello, everyone. John Heinz. I'm the executive director of ATC right now. I'm a structural engineer like the folks on the call. I've been doing performance-based design for decades, like most on the call. Before Bob, I was one of the leaders of the development of ASCE 41 before it was ASCE 41, as it transitioned from the old FEMA documents into the standard. As part of ATC for 20 years, I've been leading the development of FEMA's next generation performance-based tool, ATC 58 or FEMA P58. And most recently, I was one of the leaders of producing the NIST FEMA Special Report to Congress on reoccupancy and functional recovery. So long history of developing and attempting to lead in the area of resilience and performance-based design.
Thank you. Jonathan Buckley.
Hi, I'm Jonathan Buckley. I'm senior project engineer at Nabi Yusuf Associates. Have not been practicing performance-based design for several decades, I must admit. But I've been fairly active on a lot of the resilience committees and EERI, CEOC, CEONC, NCSEA, and things of that nature, and trying to contribute to a lot of these other efforts that are going on in the background. And so just interested to see how performance code can really move this ball forward.
Thank you. JQ Yuan.
Hello, everyone. So my name is JQ Yuan. Also, by training, I'm a structural engineer. I work for the National Institute of Building Sciences. But for the topic related to today, I am the executive director for the Multi-Hazard Mitigation Council, known as the MMC, also the Building Seismic Safety Council, known as the BSSC at NAPES. So I'm the least senior person here. I don't have 30, 20 years performance-based design, but I think I'm here today related to some work we do on the topic. One thing we are kicking off for the 2026 NECRP cycle that will fit into the ASCE 7 IBC. We are still in the planning phase. As many of you have been involved in the conversation, we know the functional recovery performance-based design will be one of the central topic for the 2020 NECRP provisions. So going to be here today also bring some of the feedbacks back to that group. But also want to mention some of the other work we do at NAPES under MMC. That is much broader group based on the multi-hazard. We do research like the mitigation safe study. Some of you may have heard, for every dollar we invest, make building stronger and better, you will save $6, $11, $13 nationwide in the future. So we do bring from that angle, from other factors beyond the engineer society, the social factors, the economic factors, also through the finance, insurance, ultimately, hopefully can influence the policy making in general to support the broader movement to go beyond life safety, to go to the performance-based design, to make an economic case. Let me end up with that. Thank you.
Thank you. Steve McCabe.
Good morning. I'm Steve McCabe. I work at NIST. I'm the NEHRP director for the NEHRP program. I've been involved in seismic issues for nearly 50 years, and have been involved with our own NIST research, as well as funding other studies, some of which have been mentioned here, to get at improved methods for performance-based design, as well as looking at immediate occupancy and functional recovery issues on behalf of our friends in Congress. So I'm looking forward to see how this workshop goes.
Thank you. Michael Dillon.
Good morning, Michael Dillon from Ontario, Toronto, specifically. So I have a fairly long experience building code issues, being with the Ministry of Municipal Affairs and Housing in Toronto, which is responsible for building code regulation in Ontario. While I was there, the Ontario Building Code shifted to a we call an objective-based code format. I have other hats as well. I've been working with the World Bank since 2007, and with the International Building Quality Center, a new entity in Australia, looking at building regulatory practices around the world, trying to support best practices. And I'm a director of regulatory reform in a building association in Ontario called ResCon. And I have my own company, so I do other things as well. So it's a very interesting session. I was involved in some building code changes that certainly would benefit from a more of a performance-based approach. But aside from that, I mean, it's obviously a global trend moving in that direction. One of my initial sort of comments about our approach to this is it's not a binary issue. It's not. It's essentially what we have in Ontario is a hybrid. I think that's probably the case in many jurisdictions. But I'll leave those comments for later when we get into the substance of the topics that we're talking about today, which is of course performance-based code approach. So that's it for me. Thanks.
Thank you. Joseph Chappelle. Maybe stepped away. David Bonowicz.
Good morning, everyone. A lot of the stuff you've already heard, familiar and worked on the work with SPUR, NIST CRPG, lead author of the ERI white paper on community resilience, lead author of the NIBS white paper on resilience-based design, member of the FEMA NIST functional recovery expert committee, do a lot of code consulting and mitigation program development for local jurisdictions. I'm glad to see Michael on because otherwise we look kind of California and earthquake heavy. So I guess we'll interested to see where the conversation goes.
We have very few earthquakes up here.
Try to get some.
Yeah.
Be one of us.
Well, near Cornwall and so on, we have a bit of a belt, but nothing like what you have up there, down there, wherever.
Okay, one more time. I'll see if Joseph is there and introduce himself.
Can I ask, is that Micah Chappelle? Is it the same? That's not the same Chappelle from Seattle?
I don't think so.
Okay.
Okay, well, we'll just kick off in any case. And so, you know, for today, what I'm hoping to do is listen more than talk. But what I want to maybe start with is to understand the different perspectives of, you know, what you see as resilience, you know, how is it defined and how should a performance code, you know, address resilience, you know, across the sector. And maybe even a starting point is, should we build resilience as a concept into the performance code? Arguably, it's not there as an objective. Typically, we think in performance codes or objective-based codes, as in Canada, you kind of start with your top level societal objectives. It's not currently in the ICCPC. If we go forward, should it be? How is it defined? And is, you know, performance a good way to achieve resilience objectives? So with that, I'll open it up to anyone who wants to kick off the discussion. All small questions.
Brian, are you seeing the hand? Are you seeing the hands raised? I'm waiting for you to call on.
Yeah, go ahead, David. Thank you.
Well, the short answer to your question is yes, we should, but it doesn't have to be in the performance code only. We should be trying to build design and resilience into the model codes as well. And we've been trying to do that in California. And in order to do that, as I think, well, this might be new to Michael, but I think everybody else on the call has, in our various committees, has seen the way we've outlined how to do that, which is to make a conceptual leap from resilience, which is kind of community organizationally based, to something we call functional recovery, which is more designable and writable in terms of code provisions. So by making that shift, we've been trying in California through legislation and through voluntary programs and not really taking hold, but trying to build that into the model code as well. It's performance-based by definition, if you think of resilience and functional recovery as being measured in terms of recovery time, then it's kind of very much parallel to a lot of the stuff we've been doing in the earthquake field for some time.
Great. So maybe I'll just jump in quickly, because there will be people who are not working in this area who may watch this. How do you define functional recovery? Just, for non-structural engineers or lay persons?
Well, I'll let John and Ryan read from the book that we wrote, which gives a definition for the first time. It's basically maintaining the basic intended functions after some event. You have to define the event, and that makes it performance-based, and you have to define what your acceptable recovery time is for buildings of different uses. And then there's a parallel definition that goes with infrastructure as well. And then there's an understanding that there's also something called reoccupancy, which is an earlier milestone than functional recovery. So there's parallel definitions for that as well. But we're not defining resilience in those terms, because resilience in terms of community resilience is given to us now in federal statute. Mm-hmm. And it's kind of a vague definition from an engineer's perspective, but it's consistent with the definition that's developed over the last 20 years as a community kind of more focused on the community recovery basis.
Okay.
So I'll chime in on that. The one thing I agree with what David said. The one thing you were missing, David, was the important notion of basic function. So we need to define what level of functionality is acceptable at that recovery time, because the definition put forward allows for the fact that the building is not perfectly functional. And that's an important definition in and of itself. How much function is acceptable at that time after whatever event?
And do you all see function as the primary objective in the code, and the performance design is demonstrating the achievement of function? Or do you have also separate performance requirements? How do we kind of match up performance and function?
Do you mean the current code?
Just conceptual, going forward. So for example, I spoke with energy engineers, and they talk now about outcome-based performance standards. So there's performance design for demonstrating compliance with the regulation, but also the need to demonstrate that outcomes are achieved into the future. And so they have kind of a two-stage process where there's performance design for compliance and a performance outcome that has to be achieved over time. And so you have almost a two-phase component. And I'm trying to understand if something similar is here. So I have Bob, and then I have JQ.
So I think for functional recovery or function preservation is a component of it, as is safety. And I think historically our building codes have addressed both, albeit not explicitly, especially with like damage control and function preservation. There's always things that happen after major disasters where, piecemeal, there are changes in codes, whether it be through the, reference industry standards or the design standards. But there's a lot interspersed in there. And one of the things that we brought up when we started looking at performance-based design in ASC 7 was the explicit recognition that you can't just target one of the things. You can't just target safety and expect to get function, and you can't, and vice versa. You can't just target function and expect to get safety. There's usually different reliabilities for the two, and especially in a performance-based design where you're stripping away all these piecemeal things that we threw into codes in response to major disasters, you can lose one of the two if you're just focusing singularly. So I think it's a key component. And to me, there's not just functional recovery, but there's also some baseline intensity of a hazard where there is no loss of function. And those things need to be decided on by society as to what, when looking at cost benefit of what is the baseline that we want to ascribe in a performance-based code.
Okay, so I have JQ, then John, then David. You're on mute.
You're muted.
Sorry about that. So I'm saying, so mine is rather comments of more of a question in general. Just if we step back, thinking about the performance-based design versus the functional recovery, of course, there are a lot of linkage between these two. But if we think about who will be our target audience or who will be the buildings we'll try to influence, maybe I guess my question is for the performance-based design has been there for over 20 years, like John and Steve mentioned, has been the FEMA P58 is there for many years. Who are the current users? How widely or extensively that has been used? In my understanding, normally that's for high-rise building, big buildings, not really for all buildings. But the functional recovery probably is more fundamental. It's kind of affect much breadth of building clusters, changing from our current life safety-based design in general in the I code to next step move forward. I'm not sure if my understanding is correct, but I think maybe to think about who will be the audience this thing will affect, maybe that will clarify some things. Yeah.
Yeah, so maybe a quick comment here. I think a lot of what we're trying to do, what I'm trying to achieve in this first phase is trying to understand these differences, what the expectations are, what the terminology is, how do we get everybody on board with a common understanding. And there likely will be different frameworks and different targets, and having kind of a clear set of what we're talking about is really important. So I think performance-based design maybe has only been done for a few buildings relatively and by a few firms, even though it's been out there for 20 years. But the performance approaches may have more applicability to other buildings and to achieve other objectives. And I think that's part of the discussion. So there's the baseline of the the functional recovery. I think another thing that we're talking about here more explicitly is resilience as an objective in addition to life safety, which isn't explicit, I think, in the current performance code anyway. And you need to define what it is you're trying to achieve, then define how you need to achieve it, by what metrics it will be measured, and how will the outcomes be assessed. So we would have to put all of those factors into play. And I think they may be in different disciplines and different perspectives, but not in a way that somebody could look and say this building is designed completely under performance to meet these different societal expectations. This is how it's been measured, and this is how we'll assess it in the future. So all of those components need to ultimately be achieved. John.
So I was originally going to go back to your question, Brian, about the different performance states and whether they are. I'd like to respond to JQ's question and your comment. Clearly, across the entire nation, most buildings have been designed using basic code. But I would not describe that performance-based design has been used infrequently. I think that's a matter of perspective. And our current tools for performance-based design do, in fact, address all building types and sizes. And as Bob would probably say, we've been inserting performance-based concepts into our basic building design practices in the current code. So we have reliability criteria now and have decided that our code has a certain reliability of achieving a certain performance state, which is non-collapse given a certain event. So back to your point, in terms of seismic performance-based design, I like to think of the performance continuum that is anywhere from non-collapse all the way to immediate occupancy is what's currently buried in our code, and functional recovery as a means of getting to resilience is just another performance state. And in in seismic performance design, we usually look at a matrix that marries one performance objective to one hazard level. I should say a certain performance objective to a certain hazard level. And there are performance objectives that scale that performance to hazard. So a lot of times we're looking at higher performance for lower hazards and lower performance for higher hazards. And as the severity of the event increases, we expect less performance from our buildings. And that's something to think about for resilience and functional recovery as to, really what hazard level we really want to target for those kinds of performance objectives. It is a decision that could be made.
Thank you. David.
Yeah, so I want to go back to your question, Brian, because I think what you're getting here is the perspective of a lot of earthquake engineers and structural engineers, particularly, flip that, structural engineers, earthquake engineers, particularly. But to your question, if you're talking to energy people or to electrical engineers or to people designing building systems, yes, they have a much longer time scale to think about because they have a building that has to function every day. For us, a building to function every day means there is no earthquake and all we have is gravity. And we've been doing that for thousands of years. So for us, the whole ball game is some future event, right? So in the energy electrical world, they got to think about day to day, and they have to think about some maybe extreme event sometime in the future. For us, it's all about the extreme event. So that important difference is for us. We have to incorporate that to understand what we're talking about here. But there are also the different, if there's one thing I like about the ICCPC is that it does kind of explicitly get into these other areas where it talks about safety. It also talks about economy, which it measures as damage. It talks about reoccupancy in a way that the building code doesn't talk about now. It talks about recovery in a way that the current building code doesn't talk about now. And it even has a category called community, which is kind of vague, but it uses to talk about hazmat releases. So stuff that happens outside your building footprint if you're designing a building. But to your question, yes, I think you're going to get those perspectives from these roundtables. And if you have day-to-day, the building, the elevators just have to work, right? I mean, I guess you can do that in some kind of a function, some kind of performance-based way. That's not really about resilience, because resilience is kind of takes as its premise that there's some event we're trying to recover from, right? So on a day-to-day basis, yes, you could say there are day-to-day events, but they're not really in the structural world. They may be in the building services world. There may be day-to-day events that have to have very fast recovery. So it's a different perspective for us coming at it from structural and earthquake side.
Thank you. Ryan.
Yeah, thanks. Circling back around on a lot of these topics, I just want to reiterate the work from the FEMA NIST report to Congress, because I think, if this is going to be recorded and shared with others or viewed by others on a steering committee or whoever else is reimagining the performance code, I think there's a lot of groundwork that was laid in that report. It's FEMA 2090, and it's a FEMA NIST report together. And as we've talked about already, the concept of functional recovery is defined in that report. And I think it's really important just to reiterate that we see, at least the authors of that report, were more than just engineers. It was architects, building officials, building owners as well. We see functional recovery as the link between how we design buildings and how we achieve community resilience. So, just in terms of topics and nomenclature, we really hope that we're looking at functional recovery as a performance objective, not resilience to begin with. And there's good reason for that. We don't see buildings as being resilient. We see communities as being resilient, and we can design buildings for functional recovery to achieve our community resilience goals. So a lot of the people on this call have already heard that, and sorry for reiterating it, but just in case others are watching this, and we need to make sure we say that out loud. And as others have mentioned, we think our codes do a really good job right now for safety, at least for new building design, right? For modern building codes. I'm not sure our codes do us justice right now for the aspects of recovery. There's a lot of subtle words used in our codes that talk about providing for public health and safety, protecting welfare, suggesting a little bit of property protection and limiting damage, but we don't really define those well enough. And the studies that we've been able to do through ATC 58, FEMA P58, suggest downtimes and damage levels that we think, and we've actually heard from our community workshops, that the code doesn't meet the societal expectations for recovery on those aspects. And so when we look at measuring functional recovery, we certainly can measure the time it takes to achieve, like John said, the basic intended functions, not full functionality. It's on some sort of spectrum, but we can get back into doing basic function within our buildings within a certain amount of time. We can measure that with the tools that are in P58. We can set acceptable criteria or acceptable recovery times based on those different occupancy types. And I know David just mentioned that the ICCPC does start to do a good job of identifying different occupancy types and uses, not just in the terms that the IBC does, but also suggesting things like, what does it do? What service does it provide to communities in terms of its economic vitality? But those threads are only tied loosely right now in the ICCPC. So there's definitely some hints of some good work and some good thought there. But we need to keep wrapping our head around that to bring about what services do our buildings provide, what timeframes do we need those services to be recovered in, and then how do we use that information to help us design our buildings differently. So with that, I'll hand it back and circle back when I raise my hand again when I have a few more thoughts.
That's very good. Thank you for that, because I think, those components and laying out those issues is really helpful in terms of how we might think about what enhancements would be needed, what the performance code, tried to address and laid the groundwork for, but what initially or additionally is needed to build on that, and the fact that you have the tools and the metrics available to do it. I think those are all good things. One thing I would ask is if that the 2090 report, if that's something we could link to on the ICC website. I'm trying to build a section of resources to point people to, good overviews and good reports that help build on some of these functions. So I'd ask if someone could send me a link or pop it in the chat. That would be helpful.
Right, and you're just very quickly, ICC has a resilience portal and a functional recovery portal. So it's not the same as the performance stuff, but you can find some stuff already linked there.
Okay, and maybe I can just link between those two to help people out. So thanks for that. Bob, you got your hand up.
Well, I wanted to kind of expound on something Ryan says, because I agree with, and I think this is where, when you start talking about resilience and functional recovery, where Ryan is very correct is our codes dance around it, and sometimes they provide it, but they provide it for the wrong buildings. And what we found, going all the way back to that initial SPUR resilient city, is when you look at how community disaster recovery planners envision buildings being usable, there's a disconnect between how the codes have identified the importance of those buildings through the risk categories. And that was a major component of the NIST community resilience guidelines, is letting communities make the decision of what buildings need to be ascribed what risk category, and maybe we're needing to add different performance metrics that are currently either implicit or we think we get them, but we don't have any explicit direction to actually achieve them, and go from there. And this is something where I think it becomes a much bigger topic than just the performance code, because it gets into what can be a very contentious thing, which is what buildings are ascribed to what risk category. And there are definitely industries and affected parties that will have some very strong opinions, because one could argue the importance of housing is a lot more significant than just a other building. Grocery stores, again, designed as a standard building, whereas office buildings, and I think the whole COVID-19 pandemic really showed us that, maybe office buildings can be considered, the kind of baseline tier, but certain things that are in the baseline tier are a lot more important than maybe we're giving them, that we're focusing on. But when doing something like that, especially when you start talking about housing, you can't have this discussion without the National Association of Home Builders in the room, and that they would need to be engage, because they bring a very important perspective on something like this.
Absolutely. And, hopefully, as we go along, we'll be getting more stakeholders brought in, and I should point out also kind of what we expect to do in the next phase, and this will be early February, is once this roundtable series is over, hopefully we'll get, all these perspectives posted and maybe have an outline of where we see commonality in thinking and where we see work really needs to be done. And the aim will be to then have a workshop, probably over 2 days, spread out over a couple of weeks. So a session around February 2nd that will allow kind of a brief overview of perspectives and breaking people up into groups, sending them away and giving them a couple of weeks to do workout sessions like you would do typically in an in-person workout group or workshop, and then bring people together a couple of weeks later around February 16th. And at this time, it would be people who had participated in the roundtables, but also other parties we couldn't reach, to kind of bring in some more of these perspectives. I think, just to lay that out there and to give you, the heads up that that's coming early next year as well. But there was a couple of things mentioned, and, the recording is good because I can go back and trigger my memory. But one thing I wanted to ask about was this issue or the statement that you don't see buildings as resilient, you see communities as resilient. And there's a lot of discussion about resilient buildings. So I'd like to unpack that a little bit. I see Ryan has his hands up, but I'll let him talk, but then I want to come back and try to understand or, get a little bit more feedback on how you see that. So Ryan.
Sure, I'll let David jump in on the resilient communities, not resilient buildings. But I just wanted to kind of tie in what Bob was just referring to in terms of some of the, again, the focus being safety-based. I've not used the performance code, I'll admit. I skimmed it a little bit in preparation for this meeting, just enough to be dangerous, probably. I know there's a categorization of buildings that are called performance groups. Those categorizations still seem to be risk-related relative to human life. The FEMA NIST report and others, like Bob was suggesting, have started suggesting, and what we've been doing in California legislatively, have started suggesting that we ought to be looking at that from a recovery priority or recovery performance, not just life safety performance. And so we've envisioned in California, we've envisioned what buildings should we call risk category 4, just to get the best performance we could to try to get better recovery performance. In the FEMA NIST report, they talk about a more long-term goal that says we're going to shift our building codes to, or suggests that we would shift our building codes to what we would consider functional recovery categories, not just risk categories. And again, the ICCPC starts to do, I think it's, somewhere in one of the appendices, there's a discussion of how do you define which performance group your building should be in. And they ask questions more than just safety-based. They ask about economic, returning economic vitality and maintaining economic vitality. But the performance group table doesn't really speak to those topics. It still ranks things based on safety. So again, I think there's some good work in the ICCPC that's been started, but I think if you really want to bring in the concept of supporting community resilience, we got to bring in those other dimensions beyond just safety. So David, I'll let you jump in and talk about the resilient buildings versus resilient communities.
But before you do that, I just want to comment on the current ICCPC, or at least how it was developed. So we took a lot of the lead, as you can probably tell from the Vision 2000 work of SEOC. We're talking 30 years ago now almost, but that informed a lot of what we did, but we knew we needed to do more. So we tried to build in community welfare and thinking about the fact that some communities may have just one facility or employer that is important to the economic welfare of the community, but there was no way to address that, in the code at the time. So that's where we tried to build in some of those other aspects in that kind of questionnaire in the annex to the performance code. And I drafted that, 30, 25 years ago, whatever it is now, but without information. We didn't have a framework more to help us carry on. Well, what do you actually point to, communities trying to determine what performances they want in their community? What they really had was the IBC at the time, or we were actually just developing the IBC at the time because that was a consolidation period, and everything really was life safety focused. And so we knew we had to go further. And I think this is a big challenge even now. How do we frame that decision-making component for the policymakers at the local level or at the implementation level? And that could be, government policymakers, but also I think portfolio holders in terms of the buildings. But then how do you build everything into the code aspect to work congruent with that, kind of a decision framework? So I think a lot of work needs to be done there. I think it's really encouraging for me to hear all the work you guys have been doing, because that takes us a lot further than what we had at the time.
Yeah, and don't take any of my comments as overly critical. It's actually refreshing, if not a little bit reassuring, that there's more than just the engineers in California thinking about this and putting words down on paper like this. Yes, we definitely see the Vision 2000 fingerprints in the ICCPC, which is a good thing, right? And we can definitely see whether it's the fingerprints of the PC or vice versa. We see concepts from the CRPG and even some of our work on functional recovery in here too. So there's definitely nuggets that are shining there for me, and those are good things.
Thanks, David.
Well, I was going to add that it would be interesting to learn how people who are not familiar with Vision 2000 and its history, how they react when they open up the ICCPC for the first time and they see that matrix, which to us is completely familiar because we've been living with it and working with it for a long time. So that'd be just interesting to learn more about where they come from that. As to the question about resilient buildings versus resilient communities versus resilient, it's very gratifying to hear everybody now on the same page, at least in our world of earthquake engineering. And the explanation for that is not that we're trying to co-opt a term, and it's not that we are trying to say we don't want this in the building world. It's that we're trying to be respectful and recognize all the work on resilience that came before structural engineers even got interested in the topic. So you can find some of this in the appendix to the NIST white paper and other work that we've done, where we kind of and you can see it in the definition of community resilience, which is now in the NEHRP Reauthorization Act. It's just not about engineering. And if you go back and look at the previous literature, you'll find stuff from architects and from psychology and from community planners and from risk managers and from anybody else who might even be peripherally or not even at all involved in the design of the built environment, talking about community resilience and what it means. And all you got to do is look at the Rockefeller Resilient Cities 100. It's a long time from their resilience reports. You got to take several steps before you get to structural engineering and to building codes. So the idea there is that we're recognizing that resilience is already something that a lot of other people are interested in, have worked on, have defined, and have understood. So for us to come in and say that a building is resilient, or a lateral system is resilient, or a roof tile is resilient, seems like that's not the right way to go. So that's why we're trying to make, and it's also dangerous, because if we start telling engineers that they can achieve resilience by following code provisions, then we're in trouble. We're selling something that we can't deliver, because we know that the rest of the world is thinking about resilience in a broader way. So that's why we make that distinction. So last point, just very, very quickly, Brian, you mentioned that there's eventually, as you go through this process, you want to get to the point of thinking about how this looks in a code. And that I want to make sure we spend some time talking about, because I said some nice things about the ICCPC before, but I have a lot of bones to pick with the ICCPC because it calls itself a code. And one of the things that has happened, in addition to a lot more performance-based engineering being done over the last 20 years, is we have a different understanding of what building codes are than we did 20 years ago. And there is, I think, an important disconnect as you and your team develop the next generation of the ICCPC, is to think about, is it really going to try to solve the problems that a code needs to solve? It can do a lot of things as a design tool, but codes these days have to be more than design tools.
Okay, so we'll come back on that for sure. And before I go to JQ, just on this resilient issue and the resilient communities and trying to think about the structural design or the design of buildings to support resilient communities seems to be the focus. And I think that's an important message that, you know, I don't want to use a wrong term, but a robust building is part of a resilient community. And so establishing the performance expectations and the functional recovery of the building to meet the resilience objectives of the community maybe is a way to think.
That is exactly the way we're thinking. And in fact, in some of my presentations, I point specifically to the NIST Community Resilience Planning Guide as kind of a bridge between building codes, which are very technical and building specific, and community resilience, which is much more holistic and community-wide.
Yeah, and I appreciate that. And I guess part of my message is, you know, I need to do a better job, and I hope I can help facilitate getting that message to other people outside of this arena, because it's really, you know, I think of resilience also as kind of part of a complex adaptive system. And you know, and resilience has got many components, and what makes up the resilience of the community is that the parts are functioning, are able to be adapted, and can recover from the events that are expecting to impact them, whether it's a pandemic or an earthquake or fire or whatever. And I think some of that framing is lost in, you know, some of the, I'll use the term generic discussions of resilience, and we need to be more specific. So I think, you know, those are concepts that will help as we frame some of this going forward. So I want to get back to JQ and then Jonathan. You're still on mute.
I remember to raise my hand, but I often forgot to unmute myself. Just want to echo what has been discussed here, you know, by many of you, by Bob, by David, by John, also by Ryan on the NIST FEMA report. I think this also kind of interest, you know, the topic here is this kind of goes beyond the structural engineer itself, right? This is involve many other stakeholders. There's one key element is on the economic case, you know, how to sell this to the client, how to sell this to the consumers. Also, another important question, I think David often say this, the time element, you know, for the functional recovery is 1 week, is 1 month, is few days. Who decide that? That's all beyond the structural engineer society itself. But I guess the point here is, you know, when we talk about performance, the PC code of functional recovery, I think ICC also is in the route try to figure out, you know, what's the additional cost, what's the benefits when they try to let engineers do the job. So how do we make that economic case? I think in the FEMA NIST report, we call the incentives, you know, how to build the incentives around this, make sure that there's something, not only something we know is safer, is better, should be do, but how do we sell this message to the general public, to the policymakers, the builders, the insurers, and the lenders? How do we build that information around that? How do we sell the cost benefit information in that whole development?
Yeah, thank you. I mean, the economics and the messaging are very important. I think, you know, one of the key groups that you mentioned in your discussion there, the insurance industry has a big role to play, and, you know, how they value things and you know, deal with insurance. So that's another stakeholder group that has to be pulled in along the way. So all good comments. So Jonathan, then Steve.
Yeah, I was going to add on to another aspect of this is it's interesting because you can design a building, let's say you design it to be recovering a function within a certain time. And I think for a performance code, it has to, which I struggle with too, on how to grapple with sort of what we call externalities of the building, that part of the building's ability to function, we just have to craft what that statement is, because it may not be able to function due to infrastructure or whatever outside of that building. And so we've kind of sort of been toying with, the building has the ability to function within a certain time because it requires things outside of the building footprint, outside of that design team's control. And even really jurisdictionally too, it's challenging to have one building enforce something on another and vice versa. And so I think that's another reason why resilience and functional recovery are sort of split, because ideally you asymptotically approach every building having this ability to function. And as you do that, the community becomes resilient. So the more buildings that satisfy the ability to recover within a certain time, and the same thing is true of infrastructure, that as you progressively make more infrastructure and more buildings achieve a desired recovery time, collectively they all become resilient. But if you have one building that is designed to be immediately functional and then the rest of the community is not, that's not resilience. And so it's another kind of flavor of that in this performance code, you have to be very clear about what is that performance objective, because it's the ability of the building to function until that community has collectively gained enough of those that it actually says, well, now I can rely on the infrastructure to be functioning within 2 weeks, because that's what infrastructure design has promised. And so now I can say my building is functionable within 2 weeks because I know the infrastructure is there to back it up. And so it's just we have to dance around it because every jurisdiction has different impeding factors and externalities, that it's not the same for San Francisco, LA, or Oregon, or wherever you are. And so I don't think it has to be a barrier, but I think it needs to be carefully articulated so that when engineers are using this, they can at least critically think about it and say, I'm going to communicate this goal more clearly than just saying you're going to recover within 6 months or 3 months or 2 months, because it's not totally within our control. And so just that balancing act, I think, is going to be very careful in that narrative or commentary of this, potential performance code.
No, thanks for that. And I think we've witnessed some COVID-related externalities with supply chain resilience, whether we want to apply resilience to that term or not, that has an impact. So, that there are a lot of things that have to be considered. Steve.
Yeah, thanks. There's been a lot of good comments made on this. There was a mention of the NEHRP reauthorization, which occurred in December 2018. That specifically called out the NEHRP program as looking at resilience, and not just of buildings, but of lifelines as well. And so both FEMA and NIST have got projects underway right now with ATC looking at the lifelines question, which is daunting because you've got all these different systems that are coming into play that support the servicing of a building that are all designed not necessarily to the same level of performance. And, so it becomes a system of systems, as has been mentioned. And I think that is a big part of this, that the building piece with a number of the people participating, the performance piece has been really well researched and refined over the years. We can do that, but trying to make the system perform resiliently so that the community can be resilient is going to be the next big step. And it's obvious that the feds, who called on FEMA and NIST to develop the functional recovery report, they're looking at this. And we don't know necessarily what the next steps are going to be, but it's likely going to be something. And so I think it's behooves ICC as well as SEOC and ASCE to be looking at this question.
Steve, do you want to mention the Center of Excellence? Because that is kind
Sure.
of, that's modeling this kind of stuff.
Yeah, yeah.
So I want to jump over to Bob. He had indicated he might have to leave early, so I want to make sure I catch him.
So one of the, I think on this topic of the externalities and things, it's also important to note all the different key components of a resilient infrastructure that are not under the purview of model building codes, that are either under the purview of federal guidelines or with the telecommunications industry, unfortunately, or I shouldn't say unfortunately, but a lot of trade association standards. And so the one thing that we've had to acknowledge, with at least with some of our clients that are looking for these truly functional recovery or immediate occupancy facilities, is at what point do you say that the facility has to be self-contained? And that becomes I mean, in California, there's explicit code requirements for hospitals to be self-sufficient for a certain period of time, which is a huge design add to the what traditionally and I'm not just talking about the structural engineers, but it comes into the architectural, the MEP design of a facility. And so if we're going to be, looking at things like this, there will probably be a class of buildings where self-sufficiency becomes a design consideration. And so we need to recognize that we may be going there in explicit code language. And this is, again, where we cross over and the ICC moves from being the kind of like alternate to the IBC as the document that starts to lead and pull the IBC along, because as we start listing explicit performance-based criteria, it will illuminate where our prescriptive codes are short.
Yeah, and just a quick observation there. I think, I would say of the countries that have functional objective or performance-based building regulation, the US is the only one that has a performance code that is not sitting up top, kind of defining the performance expectations. You can argue whether every other country has it exactly right or not, but at least either in their legislation or in the regulation, the performance expectations are identified. And I think we need to get there regardless of what happens here, because you can't tackle any of these issues if we don't clarify those points. Ryan, back to you.
Yeah, I was just going to mention in terms of, we've been kicking around recovery times a little bit today, and just want to kind of start by saying, I don't know if we need to get to recovery times specifically in a very precise way right away as the first step, right? I think we've talked a lot about identifying categories of functional recovery that might indicate a priority for recovery. Of this might be recovery category A, which needs to be done quicker. B and C and D maybe can follow in short term, intermediate term, and longer term. I also know that at least from some of the ATC work that both NIST and FEMA are funding, they are convening groups to talk about some of the infrastructure services, lifeline services, water, for example. And water, I believe the framework right now they're looking at classifies customers into 3 different critical user groups, A, B, and C, to help them identify which ones need water in a certain amount of time. But it's not a specific number at this point. It's just related to the use or function of the building. So as we talk about and think about functional recovery, and we start talking about time, and we start throwing on hours, days, weeks, I just don't want people to get too concerned, maybe people outside this recording, to get too concerned about that, meaning to be very precise right away as the first step. We can start by something broad, ordering based on priority and uses, and then start to continue to refine it as additional cycles come through.
Thank you. David.
Well, I second that, and I think we're going to learn those lessons that Ryan was talking about from the infrastructure world, because they've been thinking about these things a lot longer than we have in the building world. So there's some lessons there. But I want to ask a question to you, Brian, about something you mentioned about performance codes in other countries and why the US might be different. I would speculate or hypothesize that it might have something to do with our legal framework. on that what you say in a building code, if you put out your objective in plain language in the code, now you've created possibly a liability issue for someone trying to say, I'm going to promise you recovery within a certain amount of time, or I'm going to promise you something that you really can't deliver. And that's why one of the functions of the building code in the US is that it becomes a standard of care. And it's one that can be defined and then used in a legal framework. It can be used for licensing. It can be used for insurance reasons because you've established something that everybody is going to work toward, even though maybe in the background, it actually says what the expectation is, but you will not find that explicitly in the code itself. So I'm curious if, having identified that the US may be an outlier here in terms of how it writes its codes, if you've identified maybe a reason why, or if anyone has speculated about that or whether that's acceptable here.
Yeah, I think
Sorry, could I comment that I don't know how to,
certainly.
the hand up thing is not working for me. So with respect to the Canadian Ontario situation, what we have is really a set of objectives layered on essentially a prescriptive code. The way you can utilize alternative ways of building, but move towards more of a performance solution, is by meeting the implicit performance level in the prescriptive provisions with respect to the objectives and functional requirements. So there are objectives and sub-objectives on all sorts of issues, fire, structural, etc. So if you meet the performance that is implicit, existing prescriptive provisions with respect to those objectives and sub-objectives, that is performance that is required. So that's how the code is structured. It's not a performance code per se, it is more of an objective-based code. So what is being done back in 2012, I think even before that, was the National Research Council in Canada essentially moved partway towards a performance code, recognizing that not everything can be measured and tested and validated in a performance sense. So basically, we had a whole body of fire, structural, and other provisions that are prescriptive. The performance part is we moved closer by defining the objectives that the building code is intended to achieve and sub-objectives. And the basic process is to say, well, okay, you can consider an alternative solution versus a acceptable solution if you meet the performance implicit in the prescriptive provisions that exist. So that's how we dealt with the issue of measurement and so on. It's basically, we have a document based on extensive experience and history and practice and so on, and that is the basic core document that is used. Now, we also have this concept of post-disaster buildings, hospitals, et cetera, that need to withstand, the 100-year event. They can serve within the community as more resilient, provide the community with more resilience. I think resilience should be looked at in a community sense. I think that's the approach. Essentially, that is reflected in our code, that certain buildings, police stations, hospitals, and so on, be post-disaster buildings and withstand the 100-year event.
So very, very quickly, we have kind of the same thing, except that you have to go into the commentary to find what that objective is, and it's really only for seismic. So it's
okay. No, we have objectives for fire, everything, absolutely everything, and what is called an attribution table, which links these objectives and sub-objectives with the specific prescriptive requirements. So you can go back, look at what objectives are relevant, look at the implicit performance in the prescribed provisions vis-a-vis only those objectives and sub-objectives. Because some systems have attributes which are not relevant to the objectives and sub-objectives. So that's how it's structured.
So I'm going to move over to Bob quickly because he has to run. So.
And I want to say, I think that this is critically important that ICC undertake this and in my opinion, move to having the performance code be the primary code document and that, so there is no ambiguity in what are the performance goals of the code. And also that would, like at my statement about the other things, like whether it be other industry standards or government regulations or trade association standards, there's the disparity, I think, in part because there is no one document putting the stake in the ground of this is what we envision performance being. And really, I think it is commendable the ICC to want to take this on. And I think that this should be one of the overarching goals of a re-envisioning of the performance code is to set the performance expectations across the board for all the ICC suites of documents.
Yeah, maybe it's a good observation, and I'll jump in a little bit here that, back to David's original question, some of this is our regulatory and legal structure that has to be overcome. And, I think of the building regulatory system as a system, and the building code is only one component. And we have, system-wide issues that have to be addressed, just like when you're talking about resilience as a function of the community, building regulations or the building code is one part of the building regulatory system that has to be tackled. And so we have to find ways to make that work in our legal system as well. And maybe, to give couple other examples in addition to the Canadian experience, if you look at the UK, they have England in particular, they have what they call a functional regulatory system. The building code, building regulations are about 19 pages of functional statements. And you can either apply what they call the approved documents. So approved document A would be for structure, approved document B for fire safety, and so forth, which would effectively be what the IBC is. So it would be kind of the prescriptive requirements along with any engineering approaches that have been used historically. But you also could take a performance approach, but they have equal weighting. They're not an alternative to the prescriptive. You can either apply the approved document or you take a performance approach. And so it's that legal choice that the functional expectations are what is legally required to be met. You can apply the approved documents, which would be equivalent to applying the IBC or the ICC suite, or you could take a performance approach. And they set in different documents. In Australia, it's a little bit like the Canadian approach in that the performance requirements are the first part of the code document, and then the prescriptive, what they call deemed to satisfy option follows, but you also can take a fully performance approach. And in New Zealand, it's a little bit more like England, where the performance code is the only requirement. Then they have compliance documents, which are one route or performance. So I don't know specifically that it's a legal concern that we don't state the intent of the performance expectation. I think that's more of a shortcoming that leads to all of the problems, because
it might be, but it's a context that exists, and I want to explain some of the differences between countries. A generation ago, when we were introducing performance-based design in the earthquake world, I remember very explicitly Ron Hamburger was giving presentations about this and had a little clipboard image of an engineer with a furrowed brow saying, "Oh my God, I promised something," right? And we're now in exactly the same position with regard to resilience as we were with regard to just safety a generation ago, where we're thinking about, can I write this in a codified way? Do I need to have it codified? Is there a standard of care for me to follow? And if not, am I out on my own if I just do this? So there may be useful models from other countries, but how they apply in a US kind of a legal context is going to be an interesting question.
Yeah, and obviously we can't tackle everything today, but one of the things I would like to address at a later time is this idea that many countries are looking at and using risk as a basis for performance, where you have an explicit understanding that you're not delivering a specific deterministic outcome, that absolute safety or absolute performance is not possible, and that there is some probability that you're looking at. And I know seismic engineering has embodied this for years, but many others have not. But that's also a growing realization that you get into trouble, even with the standard of care, if you follow X, Y, Z, you get a certain outcome. Well, you don't get that outcome. And, I think this whole, kind of public expectation and performance delivery is resonating as a bigger issue globally, which is So in the future, bringing risk as a basis for performance, I think is something that we're going to see as well.
I think if Bob were still on the call, he would point out that, yes, that's exactly what ASCE is trying to do with its reliability table.
Yep. So I'm conscious of the time. There's 15 minutes left in our scheduled meeting. I know David wanted to get back to some of the issues that are wrong with the ICC performance code. What I'd like to do is give everybody a chance, kind of once around the room to highlight some issues that maybe we didn't get to that need to be addressed, and make sure everybody has some input and get that on the table, and also ask if you all would be willing to engage in another roundtable discussion in the future if we can, sort the timing on that. But definitely you would be invited to the workshop next year. So given the timing, I'll do what I did before and kind of go around the room. I'll start with David this time.
Sure. I think we actually did get to a lot of the things I wanted to talk about in the terms of this last question about how to frame the objectives versus the prescriptive requirements, what role those objectives play. Are they a legal standard, or are they just kind of an overarching idea that you still have to meet some kind of a prescriptive rule, whether it's performance-based or compliance-based? I think that as long as those are on the table and we understand that, that's enough for me for now. I think Bob is right, and I agree with him that it would be great for ICC to say there ought to be a document that lays out the performance expectations of all of its codes. That document itself, however, might not be a design tool. It might not be a code in the sense that we think of the code today as a legal standard. So, but to have that document, I think that's a great role for the ICCPC going forward.
Great, thanks. John Heinz.
Thank you. I'll just jump on something David said at the last second that I observe in the ICCPC is in trying to be a design tool and trying to talk about things in general, it doesn't actually prescribe the requirements that we as structural engineers would need to engineer it. And so there's this inherent conflict of willingness to refer or not to refer to other engineering documents on the structural engineering side, which are, a lot more comprehensive and a lot more difficult to implement. So that is a challenge to think about for the ICCPC. The one thing I'd like to highlight that I'm not sure we talked about enough today is the important decision related to hazard level. So while we're talking about what performance we want and how that performance and that recovery time might contribute to community resilience, a very important decision is centered around the rarity of the event that we're looking at. And in structural seismic design, there's the maximum considered earthquake, and there's the design earthquake, and other earthquakes less than that. And there's a lot of discussion about trying to choose that level, and a lot of the early discussions about functional recovery are still looking at those large rare events, and those are going to be very difficult kinds of events to achieve very high levels of functionality. And that's and as I talked about the risk matrix before, and other examples at other performance levels, we are looking at lower hazard levels for the higher performance levels. And I'm not saying that's the way we should go, but it's something we have to look at, because it will control the level of control that functional concerns have on the design.
Thank you. Jonathan.
Yeah, I think one thing that wasn't discussed, which I don't think it can happen kind of in parallel to this, but if you go to the ERI white paper, one of the issue areas is, how do you actually implement one of these things? And there's a lot of implementation questions that I have, given that I've gone through plan check and building officials that still look at ASCE 41 as with skepticism. They look at it as some academic researchy document. And, just not to say we should stop this effort and address those, but there may be some parallel effort to bring all of them up to speed, because, ASCE 41's been around for 20 years, and it's standardized. It's, pretty much standard of care at this point, but they're still viewed with a lot of skepticism by some building officials who may not be familiar with it because they weren't up to speed on it. I think spending a lot of time on this document, that we have to be mindful that it's gonna, at the implementation end of it, may not have much use if we don't bring the building officials along with it. And so it's almost like a parallel effort. And I think this should continue, but we should be mindful that at the back end, if we don't bring them along with us, they're not, it's just going to be a lot of challenge to actually get it implemented in reality, even though if it's all the technical requirements and objectives may be clear from a practitioner perspective, that permit is still sort of that end goal. And so I think we kind of have to be mindful of that in the background as we move this document forward, which I think it can happen in parallel, but just kind of be aware of that as a final implementation issues to be addressed.
Great, thank you. JQ.
Just want to say thank you to invite us to the conversation. I think this is a kind of really important. One thing again, I will share with what I said at the very beginning in the 2026 NEHR provisions. That will be one of the central issue. But I think for this kind of conversation is really important because kind of through the NEHR, we work almost all of you. NEHR will in the end will fit into the IBC. We work with NIST, ATC. David is our lead author for our last white paper on the functional resilience-based design to lay out the directions. I think Ryan will invite you to help us this cycle. But I think it's important for this kind of conversation to happen. Make sure, really clarify the things, we can collaborate through the functional recovery program PC code, areas we overlap and areas we can clarify who are doing what. Like I think that's Bob's last comment or someone's last comment, to lay out the policy work. That's David's last comment. Lay out the PC code on the policy side. That itself will be super important, right? To give that direction. But again, look for the collaboration, look for more conversation like this. Thank you.
Thank you. Steve.
I think this has been a really good discussion. I strongly support John Heinz's comments regarding the hazard level, because trying to make this work with a maximum considered earthquake is going to be a tough deal. But I think there's a role for ICC to play in this, because clearly there are things that connect to all of these buildings, and those things are the lifelines that are necessary to make everything function. And if the performance code can be structured to support that and provide performance targets for both the buildings and the lifelines that service them, I think that would be a huge step forward.
Great, thank you. Michael, if you're still with us, any last comments?
Yeah, a lot of discussion about earthquakes, which is not really that relevant to Ontario, but I can certainly appreciate the focus. I haven't read the ICC performance code, so I don't know its content, but I think just a general comment. I think in terms of the basics, resilience and recoverability is all very nice, but in many cases, and too many cases, even the basic code objectives, whether we're talking about a 30 return period or a 50 return period, or in the case of post-disaster building, 100-year return period, that isn't always understood that these return periods apply to these building types. For example, in Ontario, I think houses are subject to a 30-year, but we don't really know. Other buildings roughly to a 50-year return period for earthquakes or wind loads or whatever the case may be, and post-disaster 100 years. But that could be more explicit and more clearly stated than it is, quite frankly. When it comes to resilience, that's even more complicated. Brian, you mentioned the ecology, and the building codes exist within an ecology, and that to me is a very important thing. We don't always build buildings correctly to the basic code requirements that are there, and I think this has to do with practices within the design professionals. There's not often very much coordination. The National Building Code, which does not deal with administrative matters, but did recommend that with respect to performance codes, there should be a coordinating professional to coordinate all the systems within that building. Doesn't always happen as well as it should. And peer review, of course, is important as well. So administrative issues in terms of ensuring that the performance-based code isn't in fact properly built and properly designed, I think is also very important. So with resilience, it seems to me we're jumping to the most complex issue of all in terms of performance at the very beginning of these discussions. So it is really an extraordinarily, it almost reminds me of the discussions in the Middle Ages of how many angels can dance on the head of a pin. It's so extremely esoteric, and not everybody knows exactly what it is, whether you're talking about recoverability or this or that. I mean, I'm inclined to think, we have to kind of walk before we can run, because the issue of performance and achieving it and ensuring proper design, proper compliance, and that everything in a building system works when we deviate from conventional practices is challenging. And just achieving all that is something. So I think, resilience, it seems to me the most difficult topic in terms of performance, maybe should be addressed, should be considered, but in terms of solving it, that may have to come later, because I think to a large extent it is a community-oriented challenge. Communities need to be resilient. What buildings then do you include in that, and so on? It becomes a very, very difficult issue. So that's my comment on looking at it in a holistic way, and also being a little more modest in our expectations. That's not my usual inclination, but when it comes to this, yes, I think we have to go a bit of a step by step, incrementally in this direction, which I think what many codes are doing. Certainly our code has done it that way, and I think it's quite good, except that I'm disappointed that we are in Ontario not using the alternative solution approach, which is essentially performance-based approach, as often as I think we should. But there are administrative impediments, has a lot to do with building departments, has a lot to do with risk, joint and several liability is a huge issue. So there are many other institutional, kind of bigger issues that affect the use of performance code. I think the whole issue of liability is one that certainly in the US you are preoccupied with that a lot. So I imagine that becomes a big challenge. I know that is underlying some of the language in the building code in terms of how you, the need to go from just defining objectives to actually having metrics for that. So I understand it's a big issue, and that certainly is a contextual issue that obviously needs to be considered. Anyway, that's enough for me.
Thank you. And Ryan.
Yeah, I think probably what I was going to say has been covered by many people already, but I'm going to wrap it back to the FEMA NIST report because it's my favorite friend to go back to. Spent a lot of time on that thing, but I think there are lots of key topics that are covered in that report, and I'm just going to start with recommendation 1 from that report was to develop a framework for what we call recovery-based objectives, and we were specific there about post-earthquake reoccupancy and functional recovery, but we do kind of generalize it to say recovery-based objectives throughout the report. And we contrast recovery-based objectives against safety-based objectives, which we would say safety-based is today, recovery-based is where we're trying to get to serve the resilient community, movement. That recommendation 1 has 3 key parts. 1 is developing the policy, which says, let's find those recovery times, recovery objectives that we want for the different types of buildings or infrastructure services. The second part is developing the design criteria to meet those goals. And then the third part is considering the hazard level that we're trying to meet when we're doing those design criteria. So if we want, let's just say quick recovery, slow, intermediate, and long recovery as our sort of global objectives, we need to identify what design criteria will be used to. Somehow we have to have some metric to measure against, as John was saying. But we need to start with identifying which buildings need to meet those goals, like kind of David and Jonathan were saying. And then as Stephen and others have talked about, and what hazard level, so I think if you look at that and you kind of frame that across the ICCPC, you see there's some definite overlaps and some similarities where the framework is there, but there probably needs to be a little bit more specificity. And if I were to say, as the engineer, I would love to spend a lot more time on chapter 3, chapter 5, talking about the specific tables that are identifying the different performance groups, that kind of matrix that identifies the performance objectives, and then talking a little bit more about what you're going to measure in terms of specific goals, in terms of the damage levels that are very vague right now, and understandably so. But at some point, we need to get to a specificity so we can design to it. At some point, we'll have to acknowledge that performance-based design is great, and those that are willing to do it will do it. But there's going to be the majority of the users still going to look for something very prescriptive to apply that meets these performance goals. So Brian, a big thank you. Yes, back to your other question. I think all of us are probably very eager to continue this conversation in other formats. And I think this is a great start.
Thank you very much. And thanks again to everyone today for participating. Very informative for me. I think a lot of really helpful input to help, frame the discussion forward. So I thank you for that. My next step will be over the next couple of weeks, summarizing our discussion today. I will send you a link in the future that has a copy of the recording and a copy of my summary notes. Typically what I've been doing is a short summary and then more detailed, and just want to make sure that you concur with what will be posted, because I want to make sure I can share with people accurately the important feedback that you've provided. And so again, next steps forward after that, if we can fit in another roundtable, not sure if it'll happen in December, but we'll try in January, and then in early February, it'll be a bigger workshop where the aim is to have people at least have a chance to have seen what all the different perspectives are, and then try to get everybody in a virtual room to start some discussion around, where do we see the commonalities, where do we see the gaps, and can we kind of lay out, excuse me, a plan forward to move in a common direction. So I'll keep you all updated on all of that as we move forward. Thank you very much.
Thanks
Thank you,
again,
Brian.
Thank you.